Welcome, weary traveler, to this quiet corner of history. Tonight, as the world outside grows still and the stars glimmer overhead, we will journey back more than 2,000 years to an age of heroes and empires. Across rugged mountains, golden deserts, and distant rivers, we will follow the extraordinary path of a boy born in Macedon who grew into a man the world would call Alexander the Great. Along the way, we will meet philosophers and kings, soldiers and rebels, and witness battles that shook the ancient world. This is a tale of ambition and courage, of glory and tragedy, and of a legacy that still echoes across the centuries. So settle in, draw the blanket close, and let your imagination carry you into the story of a man who dreamed of uniting the world. Are you ready? Let us begin. In the summer of 356 BCE, the rugged land of Macedon witnessed the birth of a child who would one day come to be remembered as one of the most extraordinary figures in all of human history. This child, Alexander, entered the world at Pella, the capital of Macedon, during a time when his kingdom was slowly rising from the shadows of obscurity to assert itself among the great powers of the Greek world. Macedon was a land of mountains, valleys, and warriors, a kingdom often dismissed by the more sophisticated Greek city-states of the south as a barbarous frontier. Yet under the leadership of Philip II, it had already begun to transform into a formidable military and political power, and into this setting, Alexander was born, destined to surpass not only his father's ambitions, but to etch his own name into eternity. His mother, Olympias, was a woman of fiery character, fiercely protective of her son, and deeply devoted to her own lineage, which she traced back to the mythical Achilles. Olympias filled the young Alexander's imagination with stories of heroic deeds, divine ancestry, and the glory that awaited those bold enough to seize it. She impressed upon him the idea that he was no ordinary child, but someone chosen by the gods for greatness. His father, Philip, a man of relentless determination and keen strategic mind, added another dimension to Alexander's upbringing, ensuring that his son would not only inherit a throne, but also a kingdom forged by discipline, innovation, and conquest. From the earliest years of his childhood, Alexander grew up in an environment where ambition and vision were the air he breathed. The palace at Pella was alive with the constant discussions of politics, military campaigns, and the delicate balance of power in Greece. Macedon's rise was still fragile, and Philip's wars against neighboring tribes and rival city-states shaped the political climate of the boy's early years. To Alexander, this was no ordinary childhood. He was raised not in the soft luxury of complacency, but in the hard lessons of survival and leadership. His father ensured that Alexander was exposed to the art of war from the beginning, bringing him to watch drills of the Macedonian phalanx, the disciplined and innovative military formation that had transformed Macedon into a rising power. The boy grew fascinated by the sight of spearmen moving in unison, their shields interlocked like a wall of iron, a weapon of both discipline and unity. This early exposure planted the seeds of military curiosity and tactical thinking that would later blossom into the genius of one of history's greatest commanders. But Alexander's education was not only martial. His parents understood that the strength of a ruler lay as much in the mind as in the sword, and thus Philip sought out the finest tutor in all of Greece to guide his son. That man was Aristotle, the philosopher of Stagira, who himself had been a student of Plato and who carried within him the legacy of Greek philosophy's greatest traditions. Under Aristotle's guidance, Alexander was introduced to a universe of knowledge far beyond the battlefield. He studied philosophy, ethics, medicine, politics, and science. He learned of Homer's epics, especially the Iliad, which became a source of lifelong inspiration. In Homer's Achilles, Alexander found a model of heroic courage, And it is said that he kept a copy of the Iliad with him during his campaigns, often sleeping with it beneath his pillow. Aristotle taught him not only the value of knowledge, but the interconnectedness of all human endeavors. He instilled in Alexander the belief that conquest and governance were not merely acts of power, but opportunities to shape civilizations, to bring order and enlightenment, and to create a vision that transcended mere personal ambition.
Alexander's character in these formative years was already marked by traits that would later define his career. He was curious, restless, and unwilling to accept limitations. When he was still a boy, he tamed the wild horse Bucephalus, which no other rider dared approach. Where others saw a beast too wild to control, Alexander noticed that the animal was merely frightened by its own shadow. Turning the horse toward the sun, he mounted and mastered it, proving not only his courage, but also his ability to see solutions where others saw impossibility. His father, Philip, watching this feat, is said to have declared with pride that Macedon was too small for such a son, and that he must seek a kingdom worthy of his spirit. That statement, perhaps uttered in a moment of awe, became prophetic of the life Alexander would live. As he grew into adolescence, Alexander's identity was forged by a mixture of cultural influences. He was Macedonian by birth, proud of his warrior heritage and of the innovations his father had brought to their kingdom. But he was also deeply immersed in Greek thought, myth, and culture. He came to see himself as standing at the intersection of two worlds, one pragmatic and martial, the other intellectual and artistic. This duality shaped the way he would later approach conquest, not simply as a means of domination, but as a chance to bring together diverse peoples under a shared vision. His exposure to both worlds meant that he could speak to soldiers with the language of discipline and courage, while addressing philosophers and statesmen with the language of reason and vision. Few leaders in history have embodied such a balance, and in Alexander it was present from his earliest days. The young prince was also surrounded by tales of his divine origins. Olympias, devoted to religious rites and mystical traditions, often told him that he was descended from gods and heroes. She spoke of Zeus, the king of the gods, and suggested that Alexander's true father might be divine rather than mortal. These stories, combined with his own sense of destiny, instilled in Alexander a belief that his life was not bound by ordinary human limits. Whether or not he fully believed these tales, he certainly carried with him the conviction that he was chosen for greatness, and that conviction gave him the courage to attempt what others would not even dream. It was this sense of destiny that would later allow him to cross into Asia with a small army and challenge the greatest empire of his time. By the time Alexander reached his teenage years, he was already showing signs of leadership and charisma. His companions, many of whom would later become his generals, were drawn to him not merely because of his royal status, but because of the intensity of his presence. He had the rare ability to inspire loyalty and admiration, a gift that would later make his army follow him across deserts, mountains, and rivers into lands they had never imagined. His training with Aristotle, his exposure to warfare through Philip, and his mother's installation of divine ambition all converged to create a young man who was both scholar and warrior, dreamer and pragmatist, idealist and realist. The Macedonian court, meanwhile, was not without its tensions. Philip's ambitions often took him into dangerous political intrigues, and the court was a place of shifting alliances, rivalries, and conspiracies. Alexander witnessed these complexities firsthand, learning how fragile power could be and how easily it could be lost. These lessons in politics were as important as any battlefield training, for they taught him how to secure loyalty, how to deal with dissent, and how to assert authority when challenged. In later years, he would often face mutiny, resistance, and betrayal, but the seeds of his ability to handle such crises were planted in these early observations of his father's rule. Thus, Alexander's childhood and youth were a preparation unlike any other. He was raised in a kingdom on the rise, trained by one of the greatest philosophers of all time, inspired by myths of heroes, tested by the challenge of mastering the untamable, and shaped by the turbulent politics of his father's court. By the time he stood on the threshold of manhood, he was already a figure apart, someone who carried within him the vision of empire, the discipline of a soldier, the wisdom of a student, and the fire of ambition. The world into which he was born could not yet imagine the scale of his future achievements, but those who knew him sensed that destiny had chosen him for something extraordinary.
Rise to power. The death of King Philip II in 336 BCE marked one of the most dramatic turning points not only in Macedonian history, but also in the life of the young Alexander. At just 20 years old, Alexander suddenly found himself thrust into the center of political storms, conspiracies, and the monumental responsibility of inheriting his father's throne. Philip had been assassinated during the wedding celebrations of his daughter Cleopatra in Aegae, stabbed by one of his bodyguards in circumstances that have remained controversial for centuries. Some claimed the killing was the result of personal grievances. Others whispered of deeper conspiracies involving rival factions, and there were even those who pointed fingers at Olympias, Philip's fiery and ambitious queen, who may have sought to secure her son's succession at any cost. Whatever the truth, the fact remained that Macedon was now without its king, and the future of the realm hung precariously in the balance. Alexander's path to power was not guaranteed. Though he was the son of Philip and Olympias, the Macedonian court was full of rival claimants, ambitious generals, and nobles who had benefited under Philip's reign and who now considered how to preserve their own power. Many doubted whether a young man barely out of adolescence could possibly hold together the kingdom his father had forged with blood and iron. Yet from the very moment of his father's death, Alexander displayed the decisiveness and authority that would come to define his rule. He acted swiftly to eliminate threats, executing rivals who might contest his throne, consolidating the loyalty of the Macedonian army, and asserting his position as the rightful heir. His mother Olympias also played her part, using her influence to secure her son's claim and neutralize those who might oppose him. What might have destroyed another inexperienced ruler instead became the proving ground of Alexander's leadership. His first task was to reassert control over the Greek city-states, many of which, upon hearing of Philip's assassination, believed Macedon's hold over Greece would collapse. Athens, Thebes, and other cities began murmurs of rebellion, hoping to regain independence from Macedonian dominance. But Alexander acted with extraordinary speed. Within months, he marched south into Greece at the head of a Macedonian army, demonstrating that he had inherited not only his father's throne, but also his military genius. His presence alone was enough to quell most uprisings, but when Thebes openly defied him, Alexander responded with ruthless force. He besieged the city, captured it, and destroyed it almost completely, sparing only temples and the house of the poet Pindar. This act sent a shockwave through Greece, leaving no doubt about the resolve of the new king. The message was clear. Rebellion against Macedon would not be tolerated, and Alexander would enforce his authority both with swiftness and severity. At the same time, Alexander understood that terror alone could not secure loyalty. He also demonstrated magnanimity, offering favorable terms to cities that submitted peacefully, confirming their local governments, and even presenting himself as the protector of Greek traditions and liberties. He positioned himself not just as a conqueror, but as the leader of a unified Hellenic cause. This balancing act of ruthlessness and generosity would become a hallmark of his rule, enabling him to secure obedience without constant warfare.
By the end of his first year as king, Alexander had transformed uncertainty into strength. He had re-established Macedonian control over Greece, reaffirmed his command of the army, and silenced his rivals at court. With Greece pacified, Alexander turned his attention to the grand vision his father had prepared but never completed: the invasion of the Persian Empire. Philip had long planned to lead a pan-Hellenic expedition eastward, presenting himself as the avenger of Greece against Persia, whose armies had once burned Athens and desecrated Greek temples during the wars of the previous century. Now Alexander inherited not only the throne, but also this ambitious project. He seized upon it with enthusiasm, seeing in it not merely the expansion of Macedonian power, but also the fulfillment of his own destiny. To Alexander, Persia was the great prize, a vast empire stretching from the Mediterranean to the mountains of Central Asia. And conquering it would elevate him beyond the stature of his father, placing him among the ranks of the legendary heroes he so admired. Before embarking on this monumental campaign, Alexander needed to secure his northern borders. Tribes in Thrace, Illyria, and along the Danube threatened Macedon's stability, and Alexander marched north to subdue them. His campaigns in these regions revealed both his courage and his tactical brilliance. At the Battle of the Danube, for instance, he led his forces in a daring river crossing under enemy fire, demonstrating the boldness that would later define his campaigns in Asia. When word of his northern victories reached southern Greece, however, Thebes once again attempted to rebel, believing Alexander had been killed in battle. In a lightning-fast campaign, Alexander descended upon the city, and in a matter of days crushed the revolt with devastating force. The destruction of Thebes became a legendary warning to all other Greek states, ensuring their submission as he prepared to lead them against Persia. By 334 BCE, Alexander had consolidated his power in Macedon and Greece, and the stage was set for the most audacious campaign in history. With an army of some 40,000 men, Macedonians, Greeks, and mercenaries, he crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor, stepping onto Persian soil for the first time. According to legend, he made a symbolic gesture by visiting the ancient site of Troy, paying homage to the heroes of Homer's Iliad. Standing before the tomb of Achilles, Alexander declared that he was fortunate to have had Aristotle as his teacher, just as Achilles had the wise centaur Chiron. In that moment, Alexander not only connected himself to mythic tradition, but also proclaimed to his men and to history itself that he intended to live and die in the footsteps of heroes. Thus, in just a few short years after his father's death, Alexander had transformed from a young and untested prince into a formidable king and commander. He had shown that he could master the deadly intrigues of the Macedonian court, command the loyalty of his army, subdue the rebellious Greek city-states, and prepare for the conquest of the greatest empire of the ancient world. The rise of Alexander was not merely a political transition. It was the awakening of a force that would reshape the known world. The boy who had once tamed a wild horse, who had studied at the feet of Aristotle, and who had dreamed of emulating Achilles, now stood on the threshold of a destiny that would carry him farther than any Greek had ever gone before. The Hellespont was not just a river to be crossed. It was the boundary between the old world of Philip and the new world of Alexander, a world in which his ambition would know no limits.
The Persian campaign begins. When Alexander crossed the Hellespont in 334 BCE with his Macedonian and Greek army, the world seemed to hold its breath. The young king was only 22 years old, yet he was about to challenge the might of the Persian Empire, a realm that stretched from the Aegean to the Indus, a dominion so vast and ancient that it seemed unconquerable. The Persian kings had ruled for 2 centuries, commanding immense wealth,
countless soldiers, and the allegiance of nations across 3 continents. To the Greeks, Persia was both a looming threat and a tantalizing prize. To Alexander, it was the arena in which his destiny would be tested. With approximately 40,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, an army far smaller than what Persia could muster, he stepped onto Asian soil, conscious that he was not merely beginning a campaign, but launching a legend. The first test of Alexander's audacity came almost immediately at the Battle of the Granicus River. The Persians had prepared to meet him at the river's edge, confident that their cavalry superiority and fortified position would repel the invaders. Many of Alexander's generals advised caution, suggesting that the army should wait for dawn or seek a more favorable crossing. But Alexander, true to his character, rejected hesitation. Leading from the front as always, he spurred his cavalry across the river under a hail of enemy missiles, his horse Bucephalus charging into the torrent as Persian warriors closed in around him. For a moment the battle hung in the balance. Alexander was struck on the head by a Persian nobleman's axe and narrowly avoided death thanks to the intervention of his companions. Yet his sheer boldness carried the day. The Persians, unprepared for the ferocity of the Macedonian assault, broke and fled. The victory at Granicus was not only military, but psychological. It shattered the illusion of Persian invincibility and proved to both friend and foe that Alexander was a commander unlike any other. In the wake of Granicus, the cities of Asia Minor began to fall into Alexander's hands. Some, like Sardis, surrendered without resistance, eager to exchange Persian rule for Greek liberation. Others resisted and were taken by storm. Alexander presented himself not as a mere conqueror, but as the leader of a pan-Hellenic crusade, avenging the Persian invasions of Greece a century earlier. Yet his policies were already showing signs of the pragmatism that would characterize his empire. Where Persian governors submitted, he often confirmed them in their positions. Where Greek cities asked for freedom, he granted them democratic institutions. This dual policy of firmness and generosity won him allies and softened resistance, allowing his campaign to advance with remarkable speed. The next great trial came in 333 BCE, at the Battle of Issus, where Alexander confronted the Persian king Darius III himself. The two armies faced each other near the narrow coastal plain of southern Anatolia. Despite his overwhelming numbers, perhaps 100,000 Persians against Alexander's 40,000, Darius found his forces cramped and unable to deploy effectively. Alexander exploited this terrain to his advantage, launching a devastating cavalry charge on the Persian left flank, while personally leading his companion cavalry into the heart of the enemy line. At the sight of Alexander bearing down upon him, Darius panicked and fled the field, abandoning his family and treasury to the Macedonians. The capture of the Persian king's mother, wife, and children revealed another dimension of Alexander's character. Rather than treating them as spoils of war, he showed them respect and dignity, ensuring they were unharmed and honored as royalty. This act of magnanimity enhanced his reputation, for it revealed that Alexander sought not merely to conquer, but also to command loyalty through generosity. In the aftermath of Issus, the eastern Mediterranean opened before Alexander. Yet his path was not without obstacles. The wealthy and fortified city of Tyre, proud of its independence and determined not to bow to any invader, refused him entry. The result was one of the most famous sieges in history. Tyre was built on an island just off the coast, protected by powerful walls and a strong fleet. Most commanders would have abandoned the attempt, but Alexander's determination was relentless. He ordered the construction of a massive causeway, a land bridge stretching across the sea, so that his siege engines could reach the city walls. The work was arduous and constantly harassed by Tyrian ships, but Alexander's persistence never wavered. After months of struggle, the Macedonians stormed Tyre, breaking its defenses in a final brutal assault. The fall of Tyre was both a triumph and a warning. It demonstrated Alexander's resourcefulness and his unwillingness to be denied, but it also revealed the merciless side of his character, as thousands of Tyrians were executed or sold into slavery. With Tyre subdued, Alexander turned south to Egypt, where he was welcomed not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The Egyptians, weary of Persian domination, hailed him as their savior, and at Memphis he was crowned pharaoh. In this ancient land of pyramids and gods, Alexander embraced his role with reverence. He journeyed to the oracle of Ammon at Siwa, deep in the Libyan desert, where the priests hailed him as the son of Zeus Ammon, affirming the divine destiny his mother Olympias had long proclaimed. Whether he truly believed in his divinity or used it as a tool of rule, Alexander's visit to Siwa marked a significant step in his self-image. He was no longer merely the king of Macedonia or the leader of the Greeks. He was something greater, a figure touched by the gods, destined to rule over nations. In Egypt, Alexander also laid one of his most enduring foundations, the city of Alexandria. Situated on the Mediterranean coast, Alexandria was planned as a hub of commerce, culture, and governance. Unlike many cities founded in conquest, Alexandria was not only a military outpost, but a vision of a cosmopolitan center where Greek and Egyptian cultures could blend. In time, it would become one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, home to the legendary Library of Alexandria and a beacon of Hellenistic civilization. This act of city building revealed another side of Alexander's genius. He was not content merely to destroy, but sought to create lasting institutions that would outlive him. By 331 BCE, Alexander's campaign had already transformed the map of the ancient world. He had crossed into Asia, defeated the Persian satraps at Granicus, humbled Darius at Issus, subdued the great fortress of Tyre, and been crowned pharaoh in Egypt. He had founded a city that would shine for centuries, and he had begun to cultivate the image of himself not only as a conqueror, but as a world ruler. Yet the greatest challenge still lay ahead. Darius had not given up. The Persian king was gathering his vast resources for one final confrontation, a battle that would decide the future of empires. And Alexander, confident in his destiny, prepared to march eastward to meet him. The campaign had begun with the crossing of a river, but it was leading inexorably toward a clash that would determine the future of the known world.
Conquest of the Eastern Mediterranean. After the thunderous victory at Issus and the long, grinding siege of Tyre, Alexander had already demonstrated to the world that he was not just another ambitious king, but a commander whose determination and vision would not be denied. Yet his campaign was far from over, and the Eastern Mediterranean still held challenges that would test his resolve, his patience, and his ability to blend ruthless conquest with strategic foresight. From Tyre, his gaze shifted southward toward the lands of the Levant and Egypt, territories long controlled by Persia but restless under their rule.
What followed was not only the consolidation of his victories, but the expansion of his reputation as both destroyer and creator, warrior and statesman, a man who could crush the proudest city into rubble one year and be worshipped as a god the next. The siege of Tyre in 332 BCE had already revealed Alexander's capacity for relentless ingenuity. Few in history had dared attempt such a feat against a city protected by the sea, but Alexander's decision to build a massive causeway to connect the mainland to the island fortress was an audacious act of engineering that matched his military genius. The months of toil and blood, the constant harassment by Tyrian ships, and the bitter final assault had left Tyre broken. The brutality with which Alexander punished the survivors, executing thousands and selling many more into slavery, was not merely vengeance for resistance, but a calculated message. To the cities of the eastern Mediterranean, the fate of Tyre was a warning. Defiance against Alexander would bring annihilation, while submission would bring mercy. The smoke of Tyre's destruction hung in the air as Alexander marched onward, a grim symbol of his willpower. From Tyre, Alexander moved to Gaza, another city determined to resist him. Perched on a fortified hill and defended by Persian loyalists, Gaza was no easy prize. For 2 months Alexander lay siege, bringing up his engines and rams, battering the walls until they cracked. Twice he himself was wounded in the fighting, but he refused to relent. When the city finally fell, the defenders were massacred, and its governor, Batis, was executed in a manner meant to echo the fate of Hector in the Iliad, dragged around the walls of his conquered city. To Alexander, this was more than vengeance. It was a symbolic act, tying his own exploits to those of the heroes of Homer, whose deeds he had admired since boyhood. Gaza's destruction, like Tyre's, reinforced his message to the world. Resistance was futile against the Macedonian storm. From Gaza, Alexander marched into Egypt, and here the tone of his campaign shifted dramatically. The Egyptians had suffered for centuries under Persian domination, and to them Alexander was not an invader, but a liberator. When he entered Memphis, he was welcomed with open arms, hailed as pharaoh, and embraced as the rightful ruler of the Nile. Unlike the Greeks, who might have mocked Egyptian traditions as archaic, Alexander treated them with respect. He participated in Egyptian religious ceremonies, offering sacrifices to their gods, and presented himself as chosen by their divine order. This sensitivity to local culture, whether born of genuine belief or political calculation, made him not merely a conqueror, but a unifier. It was here in Egypt that his vision of empire expanded beyond simple conquest into something grander, a fusion of cultures, a blending of East and West under his rule. One of the most striking episodes of his time in Egypt was his journey to the Siwa oasis in the Libyan desert. There he sought out the oracle of Ammon, a god whom the Greeks equated with Zeus. The journey itself was arduous, through arid desert sands and scorching sun, but Alexander pressed on with determination, convinced that the oracle held the key to his destiny. When he finally arrived, the priests received him with reverence and hailed him as the son of Zeus Ammon. Though the exact words spoken remained shrouded in mystery, Alexander came away convinced, or at least eager to convince others, that his divinity had been affirmed. Whether he truly believed in this divine status or saw it as a powerful tool of rule, the encounter at Siwa transformed his image. To his men, he was still their king and general, but to the Egyptians, and increasingly to himself, he was something more, a figure touched by the gods, destined to rule the world. It was also during his time in Egypt that Alexander founded one of his greatest legacies, the city of Alexandria. Situated on the Mediterranean coast at the mouth of the Nile, Alexandria was carefully planned as both a military base and a hub of trade and culture. Unlike many hastily built garrisons, this city was designed with vision. Its grid layout, broad avenues, and harbors reflected both Greek urban planning and the strategic needs of empire. Alexander intended Alexandria to be a bridge between Greece and Egypt, a place where cultures could meet, knowledge could be exchanged, and commerce could flourish. Though he would not live to see its full glory, Alexandria would go on to become one of the most important cities of the ancient world, home to the famous Library of Alexandria, a center of learning that preserved and expanded human knowledge for centuries. In this city, we see the side of Alexander that was more than conqueror, the builder who sought to create lasting legacies, not merely destroy. And by 331 BCE, with Egypt secured, Alexander was ready to turn once again to Persia. Darius III, humiliated at Issus, but still ruling over a vast empire, had assembled another massive army to stop him. The stage was set for the confrontation that would determine the fate of the ancient world, the Battle of Gaugamela. But before he marched eastward to that decisive moment, Alexander had reshaped the eastern Mediterranean. He had destroyed Tyre and Gaza, proving that no fortress could withstand him. He had been crowned pharaoh in Egypt, embraced as a liberator and hailed as a god. He had founded a city that would shine for centuries as a beacon of Hellenistic civilization. In just 3 years since crossing the Hellespont, he had transformed himself from the untested heir of Philip into the undisputed master of the eastern Mediterranean. The world now looked upon him not as a reckless youth, but as a man who might truly be capable of toppling the greatest empire of his age. The conquest of the eastern Mediterranean was not only a series of victories, it was the transformation of Alexander's identity. No longer merely king of Macedon, no longer only commander of Greek forces, he had become a figure of universal significance, a ruler who blended ruthlessness with vision, who crushed cities into dust but also laid foundations for civilizations to come. And as he prepared to march into Mesopotamia to confront Darius again, it was clear that Alexander's ambition had only grown. The eastern Mediterranean was now behind him. The heart of Persia lay ahead, and Alexander would not stop.
The fall of Persia. By the year 331 BCE, Alexander had already transformed himself into the master of the eastern Mediterranean. He had broken the resistance of Tyre and Gaza, been welcomed as a liberator and crowned pharaoh in Egypt, and founded the city of Alexandria, which promised to be a lasting jewel of Hellenistic culture. Yet for all his triumphs, the true heart of the Persian Empire remained unconquered. The great king Darius III, though humiliated by his flight at Issus, still held sway over the immeasurable wealth, manpower, and prestige of Persia. To secure his place not merely as a successful conqueror, but as the greatest leader of his age, Alexander had to bring Darius to final defeat. This showdown would come on the plains of Mesopotamia, near the village of Gaugamela, a battle that would decide nothing less than the fate of the ancient world. Darius had spared no effort in assembling his forces for this confrontation. Determined to crush the Macedonian upstart once and for all, he gathered an enormous army, perhaps numbering several 100,000 by ancient estimates, though modern reckoning suggests a smaller but still vastly superior force compared to Alexander's 40,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry. The Persians fielded war elephants,
scythed chariots designed to tear through infantry lines, and countless cavalry drawn from the farthest corners of the empire. Darius even had the battlefield prepared in advance, leveling the ground to suit his chariots and elephants. The stage was set for a battle that would dwarf all that had come before. Alexander, aware of the overwhelming odds, responded not with fear, but with characteristic boldness. He carefully studied the battlefield, adjusting his tactics to neutralize Persian advantages. On the morning of October 1, 331 BCE, as the two armies faced one another, the Macedonian phalanx formed its iron wall of spears, while Alexander led his elite companion cavalry on the right wing. The Persian army stretched across the horizon, a seemingly endless tide of men and beasts, with Darius at its center in his grand war chariot glittering with royal finery. The disparity of numbers was staggering, yet Alexander's men were seasoned veterans, disciplined and utterly devoted to their leader. When the battle began, Darius sent his chariots rumbling toward the Macedonian lines, their blades whirling to mow down soldiers in their path. But Alexander had prepared for this. The phalanx opened corridors in its ranks, allowing the chariots to pass harmlessly through before closing around them and cutting down their drivers. Meanwhile, the Persian cavalry pressed hard on the Macedonian left, threatening to envelop the army. For a tense moment, the outcome hung in balance, but Alexander saw his chance. With the precision of a master tactician, he led a wedge of companion cavalry in a thunderous charge directly at the Persian center. Driving into the gap between the Persian left and center, he aimed straight for Darius himself. The psychological weight of this maneuver was immense. As Alexander's cavalry smashed through the Persian lines, Darius once again lost his nerve. Seeing the king of Macedon charging toward him, Darius abandoned his chariot and fled the battlefield, his army watching in shock as their leader disappeared. The Persian host, already strained, collapsed into chaos. Though large parts of the army continued to fight valiantly, the absence of their king doomed them. The Macedonians pursued relentlessly, and the field of Gaugamela became a slaughter. Alexander had done the impossible. With a far smaller force, he had shattered the greatest army of the Persian Empire. The fall of Persia was decisive. Darius fled eastward, seeking to rally support, but his empire was effectively lost. Alexander marched triumphantly into Babylon, the jewel of Mesopotamia, where he was welcomed with open arms. The city, ancient and magnificent, capitulated without resistance. Alexander, ever conscious of symbolism, entered the city as a liberator rather than a conqueror. He paid homage at the temples of Babylonian gods, ordered the rebuilding of shrines destroyed by the Persians, and presented himself as a ruler who respected the traditions of the lands he conquered. This policy, blending force with cultural sensitivity, ensured that Babylon became one of the loyal pillars of his new empire. From Babylon, Alexander proceeded to Susa, the treasury city of Persia. Here he seized immense wealth, vast quantities of gold and silver that financed the continuation of his campaigns. Yet his conquest was not only about wealth, it was also about legitimacy. By occupying Susa and Babylon, Alexander was not merely plundering, but claiming the mantle of Persian kingship. The Macedonian king, who had once crossed the Hellespont with nothing but ambition, now stood at the head of the world's richest empire. The climax of his conquest of Persia came at Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Achaemenid dynasty. This city, with its grand palaces, staircases carved with images of tribute-bearing nations, and halls that embodied centuries of Persian grandeur, represented the heart of the empire Alexander had sworn to overthrow. When he entered Persepolis in 330 BCE, he initially behaved as he had in Babylon, offering respect to the city's traditions. Yet soon afterward, in a moment that has puzzled historians for centuries, Alexander allowed the city to be burned. Some say it was a deliberate act of revenge for the Persian sack of Athens a century earlier. Others believe it was a drunken impulse during a banquet, urged on by courtiers. Whatever the cause, the flames consumed the great palaces of Persepolis, and its destruction marked symbolically the end of the Achaemenid Empire. Meanwhile, Darius fled ever deeper into the east, pursued relentlessly by Alexander. But his own satraps, seeing the futility of resistance, betrayed him. In 330 BCE, Darius was murdered by one of his nobles, Bessus, before Alexander could capture him. When Alexander found the body of his old adversary, he was struck by a complex mix of triumph and sorrow. He gave Darius a royal funeral, treating him as a fallen king rather than a defeated enemy. This act, like his respect for the family of Darius after Issus, revealed the duality of Alexander's nature: merciless toward resistance, yet magnanimous to those he considered worthy. By burying Darius with honor, Alexander also sent a clear message. He was not merely the destroyer of Persia, but its successor. He would now rule as the new great king, heir to both Macedonian and Persian traditions. The fall of Persia was more than a military triumph. It was the transformation of Alexander's identity and the expansion of his vision. No longer could he be seen only as the king of Macedon, or even as the liberator of Greece. He was now the ruler of an empire that spanned from the Aegean Sea to the heart of Asia. Yet with this victory came new challenges. Governing such vast and diverse territories required more than battlefield genius. It demanded vision, diplomacy, and the ability to bridge cultures. Already Alexander was beginning to adopt Persian customs, wearing their robes, employing their administrators, and presenting himself as the legitimate heir to their throne. This policy of fusion would create tensions within his own ranks, as many Macedonian soldiers resented the adoption of foreign ways. But for Alexander, it was essential. He did not simply wish to conquer Persia. He wished to inherit it, transform it, and rule it as the foundation of a new universal empire. Thus, by 330 BCE, the Persian Empire had fallen. Alexander stood at the pinnacle of power, a conqueror whose audacity had carried him farther than any Greek had ever dreamed. Yet even as he claimed the mantle of great king, his ambition drove him further eastward. For Alexander, victory was never an end. It was always the beginning of the next campaign. Persia had fallen, but beyond Persia lay new horizons, new enemies, and new challenges. The empire he had destroyed had taken centuries to build, yet in less than 4 years he had reduced it to ashes. The question now was not whether he could conquer, but whether he could hold together what he had won, and whether his restless ambition would ever allow him to stop.
Eastward expansion. With the fall of Persepolis and the death of Darius III, Alexander might have paused, consolidated his rule, and enjoyed the fruits of his staggering victories. He now held the ancient capitals of Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis. He commanded the unimaginable wealth of the Achaemenid kings. He had been hailed as a liberator in Greece and Egypt, and he had assumed the title of Great King in Persia. To many rulers, this would have been enough, yet Alexander was not like other rulers. For him, victory was not a final destination, but a springboard to further ambition. Having shattered the Persian Empire, he turned his gaze eastward toward the remote regions of Bactria and Sogdiana, lands of rugged mountains, fierce tribes, and stubborn resistance.
It was here, in the farthest reaches of Central Asia, that Alexander faced some of his most grueling challenges, testing not only his military genius, but his endurance, his capacity for cultural integration, and his ability to hold together an army increasingly weary of endless campaigning. The pursuit of Darius had already carried Alexander into the northeastern provinces of the old empire, and with Darius dead, the task of subduing these regions fell squarely on his shoulders. Unlike the grand set-piece battles against Persian armies, the campaigns in Bactria and Sogdiana were wars of attrition. The enemy here did not assemble in vast hosts upon open plains. Instead, they fought from mountain strongholds, launched ambushes from hidden valleys, and melted away into the rugged terrain whenever confronted. This was guerrilla warfare, unlike anything Alexander had faced before, and it demanded new tactics and relentless perseverance. The Macedonian phalanx, so effective on the plains of Asia Minor and Mesopotamia, was often of limited use in these jagged landscapes. Alexander had to adapt, sending smaller, mobile units into the mountains, conducting sieges of isolated fortresses, and pursuing his enemies across deserts and rivers. Among his most formidable opponents in these regions was Spitamenes, a noble of Sogdiana who rallied local resistance against Macedonian rule. Spitamenes proved elusive, striking suddenly at Alexander's garrisons and then disappearing into the steppe. For years, his insurgency tied down Macedonian forces, forcing Alexander himself to engage in relentless campaigning to secure the region. The struggle was brutal, marked by sieges, massacres, and reprisals. Yet Alexander, as always, refused to be broken by resistance. He founded a series of new cities, garrisons that served both as military bases and as symbols of Hellenic presence. These foundations were not merely pragmatic, they reflected his larger vision of blending Greek and local cultures. Each new Alexandria was a seed of empire, a place where soldiers, merchants, and settlers could mingle with native populations, forging a new cosmopolitan society. It was also during this time that Alexander's policies of cultural fusion became most evident. Realizing that the Macedonian and Greek forces alone could not govern such a vast territory, he began to integrate Persians and other Eastern peoples into his administration and even into his army. He adopted elements of Persian dress, participated in their court rituals, and encouraged intermarriage between his soldiers and local women. To his Macedonian veterans, hardened by years of loyalty and sacrifice, these gestures were often unsettling. Many saw in Alexander's adoption of Persian customs a betrayal of his heritage. They had fought to avenge Greece against Persia, only to find their king donning Persian robes and bowing to Persian traditions. Yet to Alexander, this was not weakness, but wisdom. He envisioned an empire not divided between conqueror and conquered, but unified under his rule through a blending of cultures. He sought to be not only the king of Macedonians and Greeks, but also the ruler of Persians, Bactrians, Egyptians, and beyond.
One of the most famous symbols of this policy was his marriage to Roxane, a noblewoman of Bactria. Their union was both personal and political. Roxane was said to be strikingly beautiful, and Alexander's choice to wed her revealed that his relationships were not solely matters of strategy. Yet the marriage also had profound symbolic weight. By taking a Bactrian princess as his queen, Alexander demonstrated his commitment to integrating Eastern elites into his vision of empire. To the local peoples, it was a gesture of respect and acceptance. To his Macedonian companions, however, it was another reminder that their king was drifting further from their traditions. Still, Roxane remained a central figure in Alexander's later years, and their marriage produced his only legitimate heir. The campaigns in Central Asia also revealed the more ruthless side of Alexander's rule. The resistance was fierce, and his patience was not infinite. When fortresses resisted, he sometimes ordered massacres. When tribes refused submission, he made brutal examples of them. One of the most dramatic episodes occurred at the so-called Sogdian Rock,
a fortress perched high upon cliffs and believed to be impregnable. Its defenders mocked Alexander, declaring that only men with wings could capture it. Alexander responded with characteristic determination. He ordered a group of his soldiers, skilled climbers, to scale the cliffs at night. When the defenders awoke to see Macedonians standing on the heights above them, they surrendered in shock. Such feats combined Alexander's boldness with his psychological understanding of warfare. He broke not only walls, but the will of his enemies. These years of eastward expansion also took a toll on Alexander personally. The endless campaigns, the constant resistance, and the strain of maintaining loyalty among his men began to weigh heavily upon him. His court grew tense, filled with rivalries and suspicions. The execution of Philotas, a trusted general accused of conspiracy, and the subsequent killing of his father Parmenion, one of Alexander's oldest companions, revealed both Alexander's paranoia and his ruthless determination to protect his authority. These episodes shook the army, for they showed that no bond, however old or strong, was beyond the reach of suspicion. The man who had once been surrounded by friends and companions was becoming increasingly isolated, caught between the demands of empire and the fear of betrayal. Yet for all the hardship, Alexander pressed ever onward. His conquests in Bactria and Sogdiana secured the northeastern frontiers of his empire, bringing under his control lands that no Greek before him had ever dreamed of ruling. His marriage to Roxane symbolized his vision of cultural unity, while his foundation of new cities planted the seeds of Hellenistic civilization deep in Central Asia. The price had been high: endless bloodshed, growing tensions with his men, and the loss of some of his oldest allies. But the result was an empire larger than any the world had seen. Still, Alexander's ambition was not sated. Beyond the mountains of the Hindu Kush lay India, a land of legendary wealth and wonders, a place that beckoned him as the next horizon of conquest. Thus, by 327 BCE, Alexander had carried his armies farther than any Macedonian had imagined. He had crushed the last remnants of Persian resistance, subdued the fierce tribes of Central Asia, and laid the foundation for a new kind of empire that fused East and West. But the challenges of these campaigns had left scars on his army, on his relationships, and perhaps even on his mind. As he turned his eyes toward India, both his men and the world wondered how far he could go and whether there would ever be an end to his restless drive for conquest.
India and the limits of conquest. By 327 BCE, Alexander's empire already stretched farther than the dreams of his father Philip could ever have envisioned. He was master of Greece, Egypt, Persia, and Central Asia, and he had taken for himself the title of Great King, Pharaoh, and Shahanshah. Yet to Alexander, the conquest of Bactria and Sogdiana was not an end but a threshold. Beyond the towering peaks of the Hindu Kush lay India, a land of immense mystery, said to be rich in gold, exotic creatures, and powerful kings. Greek travelers and Persian records alike spoke of elephants as vast as mountains and rivers wider than seas. To the restless Macedonian king, India was both a challenge and a destiny. Having defeated Darius and inherited the Persian Empire, he now sought to surpass the boundaries of myth itself, to press into the edge of the known world, and perhaps to become a living god in the eyes of men. Crossing into India was no small feat. Alexander led his army across the treacherous passes of the Hindu Kush, braving snow, avalanches, and sheer cliffs. The soldiers, already weary from years of relentless campaigning, grumbled under their breath, but still followed their king. Alexander himself shared their hardships, marching on foot when necessary, enduring the same hunger and exhaustion as his men, and always placing himself at the forefront of danger.
This shared suffering helped preserve the loyalty of his troops, though the strain of endless conquest was beginning to show. In every step of this new campaign, Alexander had to balance the boldness of his vision with the growing resistance of men who had given more than a decade of their lives to his ambitions. The first Indian rulers to encounter Alexander were the local kings of the Punjab. Some submitted readily, recognizing the futility of opposing the Macedonian juggernaut. Others resisted fiercely, forcing Alexander into a series of brutal sieges and battles. The most famous of these came in 326 BCE at the Battle of the Hydaspes River, where Alexander faced King Porus, a ruler of remarkable courage and dignity. Porus commanded not only infantry and cavalry, but also war elephants, beasts unfamiliar to the Macedonians and terrifying to behold in the heat of battle. When Alexander's army first saw the elephants lined up across the river, their sheer size struck fear into the men. These were creatures unlike anything in Greece or Persia, towering monsters clad in armor, capable of trampling men and horses alike. Yet Alexander, as always, turned fear into opportunity. Knowing that a direct assault across the river would be suicide, he devised a bold stratagem. Under cover of darkness and a raging storm, he led a portion of his army upstream, secretly crossing the river at a concealed ford. When dawn broke, Porus saw Alexander advancing upon him from an unexpected direction. The battle that followed was one of the hardest fought of Alexander's career. The elephants rampaged through the Macedonian lines, trampling soldiers and tossing men into the air with their tusks. Horses panicked at the smell of the beasts, and chaos threatened to overwhelm the phalanx. Yet Alexander adapted, directing his men to target the elephants' handlers and using his cavalry to outflank Porus's forces. Slowly the Macedonian discipline overcame the Indian might, and Porus himself was wounded and captured.
What followed, however, revealed another side of Alexander's character. When Porus was brought before him in chains, Alexander asked how he wished to be treated. The proud king responded simply, "Like a king." Impressed by his dignity, Alexander not only spared Porus, but restored him to his throne, making him a loyal ally. This act of magnanimity became legendary, a reminder that Alexander sought not merely to destroy, but also to integrate. By respecting Porus, he won the loyalty of the local population and secured his position in the region. In the long run, the alliance with Porus proved more valuable than conquest by force alone, for it allowed Alexander to present himself as a unifier rather than an oppressor. Yet despite the brilliance of his victory, the campaign in India revealed the limits of conquest. The battle at Hydaspes was costly, and the Macedonian army, weary from years of war, began to show open resistance. When Alexander pressed to march farther east, toward the Ganges and perhaps beyond, his men refused. They had heard tales of vast kingdoms, endless armies, and more elephants waiting in the east. They had marched thousands of miles from their homes, through deserts, mountains, and rivers, and many longed only to see their families again. At the Hephaestion River, Alexander called his army together, hoping to inspire them with speeches of glory and destiny. He reminded them of their victories, of the empire they had built, and of the immortality that awaited those who followed him. But this time, the men stood firm. Even the most loyal veterans begged for rest. For the first time in his career, Alexander was forced to turn back. His ambition had met the immovable limit of human endurance. The return journey was as brutal as any battle. Instead of taking the easier routes back through Bactria, Alexander decided to march his army through the Gedrosian Desert, modern-day Macron. It was a disastrous choice, perhaps driven by pride, perhaps by the desire to emulate the mythical journeys of heroes like Semiramis and Cyrus, who had once attempted the same route. The desert was merciless. Blazing sun, Endless dunes and scarce water reduced the army to desperation. Thousands died of thirst and exhaustion. Alexander himself suffered alongside his men, famously refusing a helmet filled with water offered to him by a soldier, pouring it into the sand so that he would not drink what his army could not share. Acts like these sustained loyalty, but the ordeal left scars on both leader and followers. By the time the survivors staggered out of the desert, the army had been reduced and broken, their faith in endless conquest shaken forever. The Indian campaign marked both the height and the turning point of Alexander's career. At Hydaspes, he had demonstrated once again his unmatched tactical brilliance, defeating an enemy with unfamiliar weapons and turning a fearsome adversary into an ally. Yet at the Hephaestion, he had faced the one opponent even he could not overcome, the will of his own men. For the first time, Alexander had been forced to abandon a dream, to acknowledge that even his boundless ambition could not carry his army forever forward. The Gedrosian March, with its horrors, underscored the price of such ambition, the human cost that could not be erased by glory alone. By 324 BCE, Alexander had returned westward, his empire stretching from Greece to India, but his army diminished and weary. He had achieved more than any conqueror before him, but the question of what to do with his vast dominion remained. His gaze was already shifting to new plans, consolidation, governance, and even new conquests beyond Arabia. Yet the Indian campaign had shown Alexander the limits of what could be achieved by conquest alone. From this point onward, the challenge would no longer be how far he could march, but how he could hold together the world he had already won.
Final years and legacy. By the time Alexander and his weary troops returned from India in 324 BCE, the great king stood at the very summit of human achievement. His empire stretched across 3 continents, from the mountains of Macedon to the sands of Egypt, from the palaces of Persia to the distant rivers of India. No ruler in recorded memory had commanded such an expanse. He was hailed not only as king of Macedon and hegemon of Greece, but also as pharaoh of Egypt and great king of Persia. To some, he was even more than mortal, son of Zeus Ammon, destined to rule the world. And yet, in these final years, Alexander's victories began to exact their toll. His empire was vast, but his soldiers were exhausted, his companions fewer, and his own health strained by the relentless weight of ambition. The years that followed were marked not by new triumphs of conquest, but by grief, growing isolation, and a foreshadowing of an empire destined to shatter upon his death. One of the greatest blows to Alexander came with the death of his closest friend and companion, Hephaestion. The bond between the two men had been forged in youth and deepened through the trials of conquest. Hephaestion was not only Alexander's trusted general, but also the person in whom he confided his thoughts, plans, and dreams. Their relationship was so profound that many compared it to that of Achilles and Patroclus, the legendary companions of Homer's Iliad. In 324 BCE, however, Hephaestion fell ill in Ecbatana and died suddenly, perhaps from fever. The loss devastated Alexander. He mourned with a grief that shocked even his closest followers, refusing food, shaving his head in mourning, and ordering extravagant funeral honors. Hephaestion was declared a divine hero, temples were planned in his name, and his memory was woven into the fabric of Alexander's empire. Yet the brief also revealed the loneliness of a man who, despite commanding millions, found himself bereft of the one companion who had truly understood him. After Hephaestion's death, Alexander's behavior grew increasingly erratic, his sense of mortality sharpened.
He immersed himself in plans for new conquests, speaking of invading Arabia, perhaps even pressing farther west into Carthage or east into China, visions that revealed the boundless nature of his ambition. He also accelerated efforts to integrate his diverse empire. At Susa in 324 BCE, he arranged a mass wedding between his leading Macedonian officers and Persian noblewomen, hoping to bind together East and West through bloodlines. He himself had already married Roxane, the Bactrian princess, but now he also took 2 Persian brides, daughters of Darius and Artaxerxes, further cementing his claim as heir to the Persian line. Yet these policies deepened the rift between Alexander and his Macedonian veterans. Many resented the adoption of Persian customs, the elevation of Persians into positions of command, and the idea of mingling bloodlines with those they had spent years fighting. Though Alexander sought to create unity, his vision often felt like betrayal to the men who had followed him across continents. Mutinies and discontent began to surface more openly. At Opus, when Alexander attempted to send home veterans who were too old or wounded to fight, many of the soldiers erupted in protest. They accused him of dishonoring them by replacing them with Persians. Alexander's response was furious. He executed ringleaders and for days refused to see his men. Finally, in a dramatic gesture of reconciliation, he called an assembly, declaring that all were his equals and that he owed his victories to their loyalty. He embraced them as brothers, and the mutiny dissolved into reconciliation. Yet the incident revealed how fragile the bonds of loyalty had become after so many years of war. As tensions simmered, Alexander pressed on with his grand vision. In Babylon, he began planning new campaigns, including a massive invasion of Arabia. Ships were constructed, supplies gathered, and routes mapped. But fate intervened. In 323 BCE, after a night of heavy drinking during a banquet, Alexander was struck by a sudden fever. Over the course of several days, his condition worsened until he could no longer speak. His generals gathered around his bed, asked to whom he would leave his empire. According to legend, he whispered only, "to the strongest." Others claim he gestured that his empire should go to Crateroi, the strongest, or perhaps to his general Craterus. Whatever his intention, his failure to leave a clear air doomed his empire to fracture. On June 10th, 323 BCE, Alexander the Great died in Babylon at the age of only 32.
The shock of his death rippled across the ancient world. His soldiers wept openly, unwilling to believe that the man who had conquered nations and defied death on countless battlefields could be taken by illness. His body was placed in a magnificent golden sarcophagus, intended to be returned to Macedon, but it was intercepted by Ptolemy, one of his generals, and brought instead to Egypt, where it became the centerpiece of dynastic legitimacy. Roxane, now pregnant, gave birth to his only son, Alexander IV, but the infant would never rule. Almost immediately, Alexander's empire plunged into chaos. His generals, the Diadochi, began a brutal struggle for power, carving the empire into rival kingdoms. Ptolemy seized Egypt, Seleucus took the heart of Asia, Antigonus and his descendants fought for control of the eastern Mediterranean, and Macedon itself descended into bloodshed. The empire Alexander had built with lightning speed fragmented just as quickly, consumed by the ambitions of those who had once served under him. Yet though his empire did not endure politically, his legacy proved far more lasting. Through his conquests, Alexander had unleashed a wave of cultural exchange that transformed the ancient world. Greek language, art, and philosophy spread across the lands he had conquered, mingling with Egyptian, Persian, and Indian traditions to create what historians call the Hellenistic world. Cities he founded, especially Alexandria in Egypt, became centers of commerce, learning, and cultural fusion. The Library of Alexandria, though established after his death, embodied his vision of a cosmopolitan world united by knowledge. Greek became the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East, facilitating trade, scholarship, and diplomacy for centuries. Alexander himself, too, became immortal. In Greece, he was celebrated as the ultimate hero, the living embodiment of Homeric ideals. In Egypt, he was remembered as a pharaoh and son of the gods. In Persia, his memory was more complex, sometimes as destroyer, sometimes as rightful successor. In India, his encounter with Porus entered legend. Across cultures, he became more than a man, he became a myth. Medieval Islamic writers portrayed him as Dhul Qarnayn, the two-horned one who journeyed to the ends of the earth. Christian traditions cast him as a figure of divine will. Renaissance thinkers studied his campaigns as lessons in leadership and ambition. Even into the modern era, generals and statesmen looked to Alexander as a model of vision, courage, and audacity. And yet, his story remains one of paradox. He created the largest empire the world had ever seen, but it crumbled within years of his death. He sought to unite East and West, yet his policies often deepened divisions. He was both merciless destroyer and generous liberator, ruthless conqueror and enlightened visionary. He died young, leaving the world to wonder what more he might have achieved had he lived. Was he a hero, touched by the gods, or a man consumed by insatiable ambition? Perhaps he was both. What cannot be denied is that Alexander changed the course of history. He expanded the horizons of the Greek world, linked distant civilizations, and set in motion cultural currents that flowed for centuries after his death. His life became legend, his name synonymous with greatness, his deeds immortalized in story, song, and history. Though his empire fell apart, his vision endured. More than 2 millennia later, Alexander the Great remains one of the few figures in history whose legacy transcends time, geography, and culture, reminding humanity of both the glory and the cost of ambition without limits. And so, dear traveler, our journey with Alexander comes to an end. From the mountains of Macedon to the palaces of Persia, from the sands of Egypt to the distant rivers of India, we have walked in the shadow of a man whose vision and ambition reshaped the ancient world. Though his empire crumbled soon after his death, his name endured, carried by legend and memory through every age that followed. Alexander remains not just a conqueror of lands, but a conqueror of imagination, forever alive in the stories we tell. As the night grows deep and the stars watch silently overhead, may his tale remind us of both the brilliance and the burden of greatness. Until next time, rest well and let history's whispers guide your dreams.